Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was March 30th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is another one about the interfaith context of the late 14th century Crown of Aragon. And it's again from Violante's Register, the Commune et Curiae Register number 1822. Yesterday's document was Violante adjudicating or getting involved in the adjudication of some kind of dispute between a husband and a wife who are both Jewish in the town of Figueres. This is different. Today's document is all about a response to something that was going on in Girona. Actually, we kind of have a 2-for-1 deal with today because Folio 144R is about the same topic as the document on the verso of that folio, and the recto side is a letter to the Bishop of Girona, and the verso side of that same folio is a letter to the prohomens, the jurats, the council, the leaders of the city of Girona. The issue at hand is once again discussed in vague terms, but even though we don't have any specifics about who was harmed or exactly where in Girona the violence was taking place, we do have phrases in the document to the bishop and in the document to the jurats, the counselors of Girona, that indicate that this was some bad violence that had been perpetrated against the Jewish neighborhood in Girona. Here it is interesting because the geographical terms are a bit different. In the fourth line of the letter to the bishop on folio 144R, we have this phrase, Local dels Jueus a la nostra Alhama de Acacia Ciutat. The call, the neighborhood of the Jews of our Alhama in that city, or in this city. So the way that the word call is used is maybe something like a neighborhood within the community, like maybe the Aliyama is being referred to here as like the larger population, and the call is more of a geographic term. Not quite sure about the usage of those words, actually, and a scholar who really focuses on the interfaith context of the Crown of Aragon in this time would know that a lot better than me. But here we have a location for where there are problems occurring, and it's in the Jewish neighborhood. And there's phrases in this letter to the bishop such as dampnages mortalment, so mortal damages. There's injurias, injuries. There's all kinds of different uses of the word mal. So there's mals feitos, bad deeds. And the letter is really chocked full of that. And Violante also says that she herself is astonished to hear all of this, and that it is happening on the watch of the bishop. And then in the letter to the Jurats on the other side of this folio, same kind of sentiment is being expressed. So Violante is criticizing the leadership, the ecclesiastical leadership, and the secular leadership in Girona for allowing these attacks on the Jewish community to take place. There's a couple interesting things about this when we pull back and look at the historical context. So there's been a lot of scholarship about the history of Jews in the Crown of Aragon, and one of the most prominent scholars in the 20th century about medieval Spain and Jewish history is Isaac Bayer, and he has a few pages in his monumental work about this. It's an English translation of his work, and so I'll put that in the citations, the bibliographic citations for this episode. But basically the long story here in terms of the decades is that the plague, the bubonic plague, which hit in 1348, really wiped out a lot of the prominent leaders of the Jewish community, as well as leaders in the Christian community in the town of Girona. Girona was hit hard by the plague. And all the way 30 years later, we see that there's still effects of this because there's not really a consistent leadership of the community as a result, and there's some infighting as well as conflict between the leaders in the Jewish community and the leaders of the Christians of the town, who are the majority. So Bayer is observing how the long multi-decade context of this made it especially problematic for the rule of law and for property to be respected. There's another dynamic, though, which comes up not only in the work of Bayer, but also in one of the best books about this particular time and place, Crown of Aragon, late 14th century, which I've talked about many times on the podcast before. It's Benjamin Gampel's monograph on the royal response to the anti-Jewish riots of 1391. So in 1391, Violante and Joan, they're still queen and king, they are responding to this conflagration of rioting, and basically, I think you gotta call it a pogrom. I don't know. I think there's a lot of debate about using that term outside of the, I guess what you would say, like Eastern European context, or the, 19th century or modern context or early modern. But it seems to me like the word really applies. And it's my personal interpretation after reading Gampel's book and other books about violence against Jews that basically in the Crown of Aragon and in other times and places, but in the 14th century Crown of Aragon, there's always this sense that when the opportunity presents itself to lash out, there's always going to be a significant number of people in the Christian community who are ready. They're ready to go with violence. And so it's not so much that some kind of fervor sweeps the land and inspires the violence that would not have been there otherwise. I really think, and this is my interpretation based on the reading I've done, that there's always this kind of population that's looking for an excuse. And it is really, that population is given a real free rein in 1391, and it's kind of contagious. And the more you let that population get away with it, and the more momentum they have, then people who might not have been inclined to take part in that cruelty and that violence, they'll join in. And so it's really got a sense of momentum, but I think there's always going to be this, in the 14th century in particular, which I've read about the most, in the Crown of Aragon, there's going to be this group of people in a lot of localities, including Girona, Barcelona, and others, that are ready to go as soon as the opportunity presents itself. And so they're always being tamped down. And I think that the will to tamp that down is not too great on the part of the local authorities. So the desire to tamp that down is very great on the part of Violante, as you can see in this letter here. She's really displeased that the Bishop of Girona has let this happen. She's really displeased that the town leaders of Girona have let this happen. And Joan is also quick to write about how he's displeased. Here's the thing, though, is that what we see is that there's these episodes like what we're looking at here in late March of 1387 that just keep coming up again and again. And then in 1391, it explodes. And in 1391, Joan and Violante and Martí, they're all trying to contain that kind of snowballing effect that takes place in 1391, but they're not really able to do a good job of it, and it's not quite clear that they're willing to sacrifice all that much in terms of really like sending in people to do serious violence against the perpetrators of those riots. All right, so all of this is to try to contextualize, and basically if you want to read about that, go to Gampel's book. It just explains it so well. Now, there's others too. Brian Catlos's books do an amazing job on this too. David Nirenberg's books do an amazing job on this too. So let's talk about Girona in particular. Let's keep in mind that another trend is that around the Christian holidays, these things tend to bubble up more. There's more of, I guess, like religious fervor that's happening, and so it provides those malfeasants in the population the opportunity to do some violence and take some property of the Jews. And so we're heading toward Easter. So Easter in 1387 was April 7th. So we're approaching that date. Now, when we look at what was going on in Girona at this time, Gampel observes that, and he draws on a lot of other secondary sources. There's a lot of literature that he draws on. And he observes that April 2nd, there was violence in Girona. But here, what we can see is that the violence had started before April 2nd. So I'm not sure if there's been discussion of this before. Gampel is referring to, during his discussion of Girona, a piece by Jaume Riera y Sans, who we've read about in other topics in the podcast before. Anyway, Jaume Riera y Sans has written about some of the Jewish history in Girona and has established that there was violence in Girona on April 2nd. So is this information that is in any way new? I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and dig around deeper into some of that secondary literature. But suffice it to say that from the very start of their reign, I mean, we're about, 90 days or so into their reign, they're already encountering local leadership that is allowing the violence against Jews to take place. So when 1391 arrives, 4 years after this letter, then there's been this track record of all these local leaders hearing from the king and the queen about their displeasure regarding the treatment of the Jewish communities. And they're basically just not really doing anything to prevent more violence in the future. And that's a whole different way of looking at it versus saying things like, everything was hunky-dory, and then just there was this, special conflagration that came up in 1391. No. What we can see is that there is a steady drumbeat of animosity, conflict, violence, deadly violence, and property theft going on, perpetrated against Jews by Christians, and it is a consistent thing. Now, is that to say that all relations between Jews and Christians were characterized by that? No, because you can also find a lot of examples where Christians and Jews are doing business together, where they are creating artistic works together. So it is a mixture, okay? Just as how in our society you see that there are groups of people who have heightened hostility towards other groups, and then others who get along, right? It's a mixture. So that is the way to approach learning about this society in a very faraway time. And if you're listening to this in, the United States, it's a faraway place. So keep that in mind, that what we're looking at today is an excellent example of the conflict that was taking place between Christians and Jews. And in, I think, Girona, it's pretty clear, and we'll look at this again in a couple weeks on April 20th, that we really had the Christians who were in the majority taking out a lot of their frustrations on the Jewish community, and in some cases doing forcible conversions. So there's a forced conversion case that comes to Joanne's attention on April 20th, and we'll look at that document, and Joanne says, no, that's not going to work. You can't force somebody to convert and say you've got a new Christian. So anyway, there's that. Okay. That's today's document. I feel like I ended up digressing a little bit right there, but basically keep in mind that we're going to hear about these conflicts, but we're also routinely going to see evidence of Jews and Christians getting along and productively interacting. And it's not to say that we have a lot of examples of entire communities where everybody got along, like multiculturalism style, but we can see that the term that Brian Catlos came up with, conveniencia, like what's convenient, is really at play, where a lot of interfaith work is happening, people crossing those faith boundaries when it is a matter of benefit or convenience. One quick note about AI usage. So I'm still working on doing things with my new AI agent through OpenClaw. And because of that, I am backing off of the chatbots while OpenClaw does its work. And so today it's just me, so no AI usage for today's episode. And I'll keep you updated on what I get from OpenClaw and what happens as I keep working on adjusting the instructions that I'm giving to the agent. And so stay tuned for more info about that in later episodes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.